The brave rancher woke up to find his unexpected reward, a beautiful wife. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The sound was a stone thrown into the placid pool of Amos's morning. He paused, his hand still on the heavy timber he was splitting, his breath held in his chest. The familiar sounds of his homestead, the soft nicker of his mare, the rustle of the wind through the tall prairie grass, the distant, mournful cry of the circling hawk, were a language he understood. This new sound was an intrusion, a word in a dialect of violence he had long tried to forget. He set the axe down quietly, his movements economical, honed by a decade of solitude. He wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of a calloused hand, his eyes scanning the vast, empty horizon that was both his comfort and his cage. Then the sound came again, closer this time, the unmistakable thud of a body being forced to the unforgiving, sun-baked earth. His hand went to the Colt at his hip, the worn leather of the holster a familiar, grim comfort. He moved around the corner of the small, sturdy house he had built with his own 2 hands, a house that had been silent for 10 years, a tomb for a life that had ended with a fever and 2 small graves on a nearby hill. The sight that met him was not what he expected. Not bandits. Not a wolf pack. It was an official visit. 3 warriors from the local tribe sat astride their painted ponies, their faces impassive, carved from stone and shadow. Before them, kneeling in the dirt, was a woman. Her head was bowed, a curtain of tangled black hair hiding her face, her hands tied before her with a leather thong. The leader, an old man with eyes like obsidian chips, spoke, his voice the sound of gravel scraping on rock. "You pulled my son from the river," he said. The words were not a question. Amos remembered. A foolish young man, a swollen creek, a simple act of pulling a drowning boy to safety. He had expected no thanks, had wanted none. The debt is honored, the old man continued, gesturing with his chin toward the kneeling woman. She is for you. To cook your food. To warm your bed. The words hung in the hot, still air, brutal in their simplicity. This was not a gift of gratitude. This was a transaction, a clearing of a ledger. Amos looked at the woman, a silent, human currency, and a cold, slow anger began to uncoil in his gut. His life was a carefully constructed fortress of silence and memory, and he wanted no one inside its walls. But to refuse was an insult, a spark in the tinder-dry politics of the frontier. He gave a single, sharp nod, his jaw tight. It was enough. The old man nodded in return, his duty fulfilled. Without another word, the 3 warriors turned their ponies and rode away, their departure as sudden as their arrival, leaving only a fading cloud of dust and the heavy, unwanted presence of the woman. Amos stood there for a long moment, the silence of the prairie rushing back in, now filled with the sound of another person's breathing. He was no longer alone. He walked forward until his shadow fell over her. He drew his knife, the blade flashing in the morning sun. She flinched, a small, almost imperceptible movement. He knelt and, with one clean slice, cut the thong binding her wrists. "You can go inside," he said, his voice a rusty hinge from disuse. He gestured toward the cabin door. "There's water." He then turned his back on her, an act of deliberate trust, and walked back to his woodpile, leaving the choice, the first of many, entirely up to her. He picked up his axe and began to split the wood with a controlled, rhythmic fury, each blow a strike against the unwelcome complication of a life that was no longer his own. The first day was a long, slow dance of avoidance in the tight confines of the single-room cabin. When Amos finally entered, the sweat of his labor clinging to him, she was there, a still figure on a small stool in the farthest corner, as if trying to be absorbed by the shadows themselves. She did not look at him, her gaze fixed on the packed dirt floor. He moved about the familiar space, suddenly acutely aware of his own size, the sound of his boots on the floorboards, the scrape of the bucket as he drew water. The silence, his old and trusted companion, now felt taut and brittle, stretched thin between them. For 10 years, this quiet had been a balm for his grief, now it was a wall. He prepared his meal of jerky and cold beans, his movements mechanical. He set his plate on the table, then paused. He prepared a second plate, identical to his own, and after a moment's consideration, he placed it on the floor a few feet from where she sat today. It was a compromise, an acknowledgement of her presence without the demand of interaction. He ate with his back to her, looking out the open doorway at the endless sea of grass, a landscape that perfectly mirrored the emptiness in his own chest. He heard the faint, hesitant sound of a fork against tin. She was eating. A measure of the tension left his shoulders. As twilight softened the harsh edges of the world, he saw her rise to her feet, her movement stiff. She limped, favoring her right leg. In the dimming light, he saw that the deerskin of her dress was torn near her ankle, the skin beneath angry and inflamed. He put down the bridle he was mending and went to the small wooden chest that held the last remnants of his previous life. Inside, nestled amongst his late wife's few possessions, was a tin of salve, a fragrant mixture of herbs and beeswax. He took it, along with a clean strip of linen, and approached her. He moved slowly, as if gentling a spooked filly. He knelt before her, holding out the salve as a silent offering. She recoiled, her body instantly rigid, her eyes, which he saw clearly for the first time, wide with a deep, primal fear. It was a look that spoke of a history of pain, and it struck a chord of protective anger in him. "Easy," he murmured, his voice low and calm. "Just let me look." He remained kneeling, patient, his hands open and non-threatening. After a silence that stretched for a full minute, she seemed to make a decision. The rigid line of her shoulders softened, and she slowly, cautiously, extended her injured leg. He gently pushed aside the tattered hem of her dress to get a better look at the wound. It was a deep, ugly scrape, already beginning to fester. But it was what he saw just below the wound that made his blood run cold. There, on the tender skin of her calf, was a brand. The symbol was crude, a circle with a line struck through it, seared into her flesh, the scar tissue a pale, puckered testament to a terrible judgment. He recognized the mark. It was the sign of the shunned, the outcast. A cold, hard clarity settled over him. This was not a gift. This was not an honor debt. This was a disposal. Her people had not given him a reward, they had given him their garbage. He looked from the brutal mark on her skin to her face. She had turned away, her profile a study in silent shame. The anger he felt was no longer for himself, for the disruption of his life. It was a cold, pure rage, and it was all for her. He said nothing. Words were useless. Instead, with a tenderness that felt alien and familiar all at once, he began to clean the wound. The days that followed settled into a pattern, a quiet, unspoken language of coexistence. Amos would rise before the sun, his boots the first sound to break the stillness. He would build the fire and put on a pot of coffee, leaving a full cup on the warm hearthstone before heading out to face the relentless demands of the homestead. When he returned hours later, the cup would be empty. The woman, who remained nameless, began to inhabit the space. At first, she was a ghost, a silent observer in the corner. Then, one day, he came in from the fields to find a button, one he hadn't even noticed was missing, sewn back onto his work shirt. The stitches were small and incredibly neat, a perfect, straight line of dark thread against the faded blue of the fabric. He stood for a long time, just holding the shirt, the small, mundane act of care feeling like a seismic event. It was a message, a gesture. It was the first thread of connection between them. In response, he left a small, polished river stone, a perfect, smooth oval, on the stool she always occupied. The next morning, it was gone. A week later, he returned to the cabin, weary to his bones, to a smell that stopped him in his tracks. It was the aroma of roasted rabbit and wild onions, a scent that pulled at a deep, dormant part of his memory, a ghost of a life before the silence. She had found his snares, had taken the day's catch, and had prepared a meal. That evening, for the first time, they ate at the same table. The silence was still there, a vast territory stretching between them, but its geography had changed. It was no longer a hostile, empty desert, but a quiet, shared landscape. He watched her across the flickering candlelight. He noticed the way her long, slender fingers handled the fork, the proud, straight line of her back. He was beginning to see the person, not the symbol. He was seeing a strength that had not been broken, a dignity that had not been burned away. The brand on her leg was a mark of shame, but he was starting to understand that the shame belonged to the people who had put it there, not to the woman who was forced to bear it. The world he had built to keep his grief safe was beginning to change, the walls becoming windows, and he found himself, for the first time in a long time, looking out instead of in. The fragile peace of their shared solitude was tested not by men, but by the sky itself. A change came on the wind, a sudden, sharp chill that carried the scent of iron and ice. The vast, blue bowl of the sky began to fill with bruised, purple clouds that scudded in from the north, swallowing the sun. Amos knew the signs. An early blizzard was coming, a white wolf that could strip the world down to the bone. The urgency of the impending storm became a catalyst, forcing them from their separate orbits into a single, coordinated effort. He set about securing the homestead, his movements driven by a deep, instinctual knowledge of survival. She was there, a step behind him, then beside him, a silent, intuitive partner. Together, they herded the nervous goats and his mare into the small, sturdy lean-to. She moved with a calm assurance, her low voice a soothing murmur that quieted the animal's fear. They stacked firewood against the cabin wall until the pile was as tall as he was, their hands often brushing as they worked, small, electric shocks of contact in the cold air. They checked the seals on the window shutters, stuffing any cracks with dried moss. They worked without speaking, their actions a conversation, each anticipating the other's next move. It was a seamless, efficient ballet of preparation. They were not a man and a woman. They were a team. The first snowflakes began to fall just as they finished, fat, wet flakes that melted on the warm earth. Within an hour, the world outside was a churning, white chaos. The wind howled like a hungry animal, rattling the shutters, screaming for entry. Inside, the fire roared in the hearth, a defiant beacon of warmth and light against the storm's fury. The small cabin, which had so often felt like a cage of loneliness to Amos, now felt like an ark, a haven. For the first time, he felt not trapped within its walls, but safe. The blizzard raged for 2 days and 2 nights, a relentless assault that buried them deep within a world of white. The world outside ceased to exist. Their universe shrank to the 4 walls of the cabin, to the circle of light and warmth thrown by the fire. Sometime in the deep hours of the second night, a different kind of storm began. Amos was jolted from a light, uneasy sleep by a sound. It was a soft, guttural cry of pain. He was on his feet in an instant, the hairs on his arms standing on end. The fire had burned low, and in the wavering, ember glow, he saw her. She was on her pallet by the hearth, writhing, her body slick with a sweat that had nothing to do with the fire's warmth. He knelt beside her, his hand going to her forehead. She was burning up. The fever he had been dreading, the silent, deadly enemy that had stolen his family, was here, in his house, again. A cold, paralyzing fear, a ghost he thought he had long since buried, rose up to grip his heart. He looked at the angry, inflamed wound on her leg, which had reopened and was weeping a thin, clear fluid. The infection had taken hold. He fought down the panic, his survival instincts taking over. He threw more wood on the fire, the sudden roar of the flames a small battle cry against the darkness. He boiled water, steeping it with the precious willow bark he kept for his own aches and pains. He bathed her face with a cool, damp cloth. She was delirious, her eyes open but seeing nothing in this world, her lips moving, whispering words in a language he did not understand. He sat with her through the long, dark hours, a sentinel at his post, fighting a war on 2 fronts, against the storm raging outside and the fever raging within her. It was a penance, a second chance he had never asked for. He would not fail again. He would not let the silence win. On the 3rd morning, the world outside fell quiet. The wind died, and a brilliant, blinding light reflected off the new-fallen snow, seeping through the cracks in the shutters. The storm had passed. Inside the cabin, the other storm had passed as well. Sometime before dawn, her fever had broken. She was asleep now, a true, healing sleep. Her skin was cool to the touch, her breathing deep and even. Amos sat at the table, his body aching with exhaustion, his mind numb. He had not slept. He had watched over her, a silent, desperate guardian, as she had teetered on the precipice between life and death. He had seen the brand on her calf 100 times as he changed the dressings on her wound, the ugly mark a constant reminder of the cruelty she had endured. But he had also, in his gentle ministrations, discovered a small, hidden tattoo on the inside of her wrist, a delicate, intricate design of a dragonfly. It was a mark of beauty, a symbol of a life that existed before the brand, and it fueled a protective fire in him that burned away the last vestiges of his own self-pity. He was staring into the dregs of his coffee cup when he heard a soft rustle from the pallet. He looked over. Her eyes were open. They were clear, lucid, and fixed on him. She was weak, but she was present. She was alive. She pushed herself up onto one elbow, her movement slow and deliberate. Then she spoke. Her voice was a dry, raspy whisper, but the word was clear. "Lena," she said. She touched her own chest with a slender finger. "My name." Lena, the single word, her name, landed in the quiet room and changed everything. It was an offering, a bridge across the silence. It filled the empty spaces between them, giving form and substance to the ghost who had inhabited his home. He felt a cracking deep within him, the sound of a decade of ice breaking apart. He swallowed, his own throat thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "Amos," he said, his own name sounding foreign after so many years of hearing it only in his own head. He touched his own chest. A small, faint smile touched her lips. It was a fragile, beautiful thing, like the first flower of spring pushing through the snow. And in that moment, the world, for Amos, was reborn. The passing of the storm and the speaking of their names marked a new season on the homestead. It was a season of quiet growth, of tentative, unspoken courtship. The silence between Amos and Lena remained, their primary language, but it was no longer a silence of caution or uncertainty. It was a rich, deep silence of understanding, a comfortable space where words were often unnecessary. They had learned the rhythm of each other's thoughts, the cadence of each other's hearts. As Lena's strength returned, she bloomed. She moved about the cabin and the yard not with the timid steps of an exile, but with the confident grace of a woman in her own domain. She took the small, hard patch of earth beside the cabin that Amos had long ignored and began to coax a garden from it, her hand seeming to whisper to the soil. She sang sometimes as she worked, low, melodic songs in her own tongue, the notes weaving themselves into the fabric of the prairie wind. Amos found himself transformed by her presence. The hard, bitter knot of grief he had carried in his chest for a decade began to dissolve, replaced by a warmth that spread through him like the summer sun. He started to notice the world again, not as a harsh, unforgiving wilderness, but as a place of subtle beauty, the way the light turned the grass to gold at sunset, the intricate pattern of a spider's web beaded with dew. He began to leave her gifts, not of necessity, but of beauty. A hawk's feather, a spray of wild prairie roses, a piece of quartz that caught the light. She would accept them with a shy, pleased smile and arrange them on the mantelpiece, a small altar to their quiet, growing affection. One day, he returned from a trip to the distant trading post, a journey he now made not just for salt and flour, but with the hope of finding something for her. He had traded a prime beaver pelt for a bolt of deep blue calico cloth. He held it out to her, a clumsy, silent offering. Her eyes widened, and she took the cloth, her fingers stroking the soft fabric with a reverence that made his heart ache. The next week, she presented him with a new shirt, sewn from the cloth, that fit him perfectly. When he put it on, the fabric cool and smooth against his skin, he felt like a new man. He was no longer just a survivor, a ghost haunting the landscape of his own past. He was a man with a present, a man with a reason to look towards the sunrise. He was a man who was, against all odds, falling in love. The idyllic bubble of their shared world was destined to burst. Amos knew this, just as he knew the seasons would turn. He saw the riders from a distance, 3 figures cresting the hill, their silhouettes dark against the bright spring sky. His hand instinctively went to his hip, but he knew this was not a confrontation that could be solved with a gun. It was the same elder, his face as stern and unyielding as the winter ground. He rode into the yard, his eyes taking in the scene, the blossoming garden, the mended porch step, the the blue calico shirt on Amos's back. His gaze finally settled on Lena, who stood beside Amos, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The elder's expression was unreadable, but Amos thought he saw a flicker of surprise, of grudging respect. "The council has spoken," the elder announced, his voice carrying in the still air. "Your time of shaming is over. You will return." The words were an order, a reclamation of property. He was erasing the past few months, erasing the life Lena had built here, erasing the man Amos had become. Amos felt a white-hot rage, a protective instinct so fierce it took his breath away. But he held his tongue. This was Lena's battle, her choice. "She is not going," Amos said, his voice quiet, but with an edge of steel that made the elder's head snap towards him. "This is her home now," the elder sneered. "A white man's shack? She is of the people. She will come with us." The air crackled with tension. The two other riders shifted, their hands moving towards their own weapons. Amos did not move. He was a mountain. He was not giving her up. But he knew, with a terrible certainty, that the final word had to be hers. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. He saw the struggle on her face, the pull of her past, the culture that had birthed her and then betrayed her. For a moment, he feared he would lose her, that the silence would return, deeper and more profound than ever before. Lena took a step forward, away from the protective shadow of Amos, and faced the elder. She stood tall, her shoulders back, her chin high. She was no longer the frightened, kneeling woman they had left in the dust. She was a queen in her own right, the ruler of a kingdom of two. "I am of the people," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity and strength that made the riders sit up straighter. "But my people are here." She gestured to the small cabin, to the garden, to the man standing beside her. Then she turned her back on the elder, a gesture of ultimate finality, and looked at Amos. "My home," she said, her voice softer now, filled with an emotion that made his soul sing, "is with you." The elder stared at her back for a long moment, his face a thundercloud of disbelief and wounded pride. He had come to collect a stray and had been dismissed. He grunted a sharp command to his men, and together, they wheeled their horses around and rode away, their pride a visible, rigid line in their backs. They did not look back. Amos and Lena stood together, watching them go, until they were just small specks on the vast horizon. When they were gone, a profound quiet settled over the homestead, but it was not the silence of loneliness. It was the silence of peace, of a world made right. Lena turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears of relief and joy. He reached out and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheeks. He had no words for the emotions that were cresting inside him. So he did the only thing he could. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was a kiss that was a promise, a vow, a prayer of thanks. It was the end of the silence and the beginning of the rest of their lives.